everyone, and welcome back to ConTinual's An Hour With series of author interviews. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. My guest is Christine Wells, whose latest book, One Woman's War, was one of Bookbub's best books for the fall. Christine was a corporate lawyer with a large firm in Brisbane, Australia, before resigning to write novels full-time. As of this interview, she has published 14 novels in periods ranging from Georgian England to post-World War II France, and her books have been variously translated into German, Russian, Spanish, Dutch, Japanese, and Brazilian Portuguese, with more than 180,000 total copies sold worldwide. Welcome, Christine.
Hi, Nancy. It's so lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you. I'm looking forward to this. Your website says that you were a library hound as a child and thought authors were magical people. What made you think you might at some point try to become one of those magical people?
Well, I really did think, I was very put off by that phrase that people say that you have to have something to say, you have to have a message to be a writer, and I just wanted to tell stories. So I found that very daunting as I grew older. And in my family, we were sort of brought up with this idea that we weren't creative, that just wasn't us. And so it didn't really occur to me to become a writer until I just decided to do it one day out of perhaps boredom and in just seeing if I could do it. I didn't really think that I would ever be published. So a friend, we were saying, oh, isn't it sad that we love Georgette Hare books, and she's a Regency romance author who's long since passed away. I think she passed away the year I was born, and we just said, oh, isn't it a pity there aren't any more? And I said, oh, well, I think I could try to write one. And that's where my interest was born, and I quickly became obsessed. And then my personality type, I just can't let it rest at being a hobbyist. I have to go all the way. So yeah, eventually I gave up law and started writing full time.
Well, the Regency era is just one period in history, but your website says that you really just love history in general. Do you remember when you first became interested in history and why?
Well, my father was very keen on history, and I just remember just sitting with him, and he'd tell me these stories of great battles, European battles and kings and queens and things like that, and probably the stories he'd grown up with, and just being fascinated by these people. And that grew into an obsession with Queen Elizabeth I, as I think a lot of young women do have that, because she was such an impressive person, battling with these men all around her and really holding her own. So I think the past, especially European history, has always interested me. There's not much glamour about Australian history, and I'm very sorry to people who love it. I do not love convicts and the very hard, harsh life that people had, the white people had when they came here. And of course, the rest of Australia's history is not mine to tell. So I really gravitate towards the European history.
Well, besides history, during those years of haunting libraries, what did you like to read?
I loved mystery. Agatha Christie, I just ripped through all of those books. And I remember sitting up late at night because I couldn't sleep unless I knew who did it and who was the murderer. And my father came in and said, you should be asleep. And I said, oh. And he said, well, who do you think the murderer is? And I said, a person. And he said, you're right, go to sleep. So I loved those books. I discovered romance a bit later, but I really enjoyed contemporary romance. All sorts of things. I was never a real science fiction, fantasy, horror person, but I read The Lord of the Rings just because it was a big challenge, and I was always up for a challenge, and then I ended up loving it. So yeah.
Well, getting back to what you're doing now, the cover of One Woman's War describes it as a novel of the real Miss Moneypenny. What was your inspiration for the book?
Well, I saw my first James Bond movie when I was 7 years old. I don't know why my father appears so many times in these stories I tell, but this was him again. My mother had taken us down to Sydney to join him. He'd been working as a barrister at the time in the High Court down there, and we were to meet, do a bit of sightseeing beforehand, meet up with him, and then have a family holiday. And of course, Mum had had two fighting children for almost a week. So when Dad appeared, it was like, here, they're yours, I'm going shopping. And instead of taking us to a museum or something, intellectually improving, he took us to see For Your Eyes Only. So I've been a bit of a Bond fan. I mean, being a feminist, those middle years are pretty hard to take, but recently there's been a renaissance, and hopefully Bond will continue to evolve into the future. But I became very fascinated by spies and any spy thrillers or television shows like MI5 or Homeland, anything like that. I'm right there. So I became interested in the female spies who operated during World War II, but often you can't find out much about them, and really a lot of the spy stuff is all bound with the men. So I read biographies of Ian Fleming, and I became quite interested in him. And then I read an article about all the women in his life, and contrary to somebody who created James Bond and all of those Bond girls, the women around him tended to be very clever and witty. And one of them was Patty Bennett, who was his secretary during World War II when he worked for the Directorate of British Naval Intelligence. And so she is a real character. And I thought, I have to write about this woman. She said she was half Yorkshire and half Irish, so the battle was terrific. And I think that really sums up her character. She's a bit of a fiery temper, extremely tenacious, doesn't suffer fools. And she said, people asked her if Ian Fleming was like James Bond, and she sort of said, oh, he would have liked to have thought so, but she was never taken in by the fabled charm, because of course Fleming was a bit of a playboy himself. So when I found out that Patty was involved in Operation Mincemeat, which was one of the most successful wartime intelligence deceptions of all time, I thought, well, this is a great story. I have to write that. And of course, this was well before the movie, the recent movie with Colin Firth and Matthew McFadden came out, or was even slated. So I thought I was bringing this this Operation Mincemeat back into public consciousness, but they beat me to it.
Well, for those who are not current on their World War II history, could you tell us a little bit about Operation Mincemeat?
Sure. So in World War II, it was pretty clear to everybody that the Allies would have to invade southern Europe via Sicily. There was just no other logical place to do it, really. And Churchill said anyone but a damn fool would know. So what they wanted to do was to misdirect the Germans into thinking that they were going to invade via Greece and the Balkans. So what Ian Fleming dreamed up this scheme to float a dead body of a Royal Marine off the coast of Spain, where there were lots of German spies teaming. It was just riddled with spies because, of course, the Germans had helped the Spanish during the Spanish Civil War. They'd tested all of their war gear out on the poor Spanish villages. And so the British knew that, or hoped that, if this body with information on it misdirecting the Germans about the invasion was found off the coast of Spain, that information would make its way to the Germans, and that would influence the Germans' battle plans. And I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that it worked and potentially saved thousands and thousands of Allied lives, because the Germans moved a lot of their fortifications from Sicily to Greece. The effect on the Greeks actually is something that's not often talked about. And a friend of mine, Kate Forsyth, has written The Crimson Thread, which talks about the war from the point of view of the inhabitants of Crete. So, having read that at the same time as my book was coming out, I really appreciated that there was this other side to it as well.
Well, and you have a character who is shades of gray in this book. Is it pronounced Friedel?
Yes, Friedel.
Could you tell us a little bit about her?
Yes, Friedel was a real person too. She was an Austrian double agent. So she had been approached well before the war began by the German Abwehr, which was the military intelligence arm of the German regime. So to spy for them. And she just happened to be the sister-in-law of the brother of the head of the Secret Service in England. So potentially she did have access to some chatter, at least. I mean, nothing terribly high level, I wouldn't have thought. But when she settled in England to be near her sister, she was asked to spy for the British. And in fact, the circumstance that where she'd actually been recruited by the Germans beforehand was not really a barrier to this. That was actually seen as a good thing. She had been briefly married to a Jewish man, and they'd left Austria probably because of all the anti-Semitism there, and settled in Palestine. Since then she'd divorced him, but she wasn't really going to be sympathetic to the Nazi regime. So Friedel's job at the beginning of the war was to go around and pretend to be sympathetic to the Nazis and to get information from all of the people she met socially and through the Nazi Party meetings. And she was actually probably the first person to alert the British that the Soviets and the Germans had made a pact, because she found that out through one of her contacts who had just been in Germany and found out something she wasn't supposed to know, because it was very high level clearance at that stage. So Friedel becomes involved, and this is where I veer from fact a little bit. She becomes involved in Operation Mincemeat. And because she's a survivor, she's not really there because she has a burning need to help the British. She's there to escape internment or being deported back to Austria. So she does good work, and there were various views of how useful she was. So people who seemed to know her well thought she was very intelligent, very effective. Some of the reports, I had access to her MI5 file, which was very exciting. And so some of the reports are less complimentary, and they perhaps thought she was just not just a good time girl and interested in doing all the socializing and so forth. So she became quite a complex character as a result, and we're not quite sure which way she'll go when she has the opportunity to betray the British.
So was it fair to say that those are the two main characters in the book?
Yes, that's right. They're both the point of view characters in the book. So it's not as fun. Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. What? I'm sorry.
Well, it's not a spy thriller. It's historical fiction about the women involved in the spy game. So I think, marketing is always a tricky thing, and people who like historical fiction have really liked it for the historical information and all of this that we don't know about James Bond and its origins. And then we've got the spy thriller lovers who are enjoying it too. But I wouldn't call it a spy thriller because it doesn't have a lot of jeopardy in it. It's really not about that. It's about the women and their personal journeys.
Is there anything else about the story you think we should know before we move on?
Well, I just think it's a lot of fun. I mean, it was a very eccentric operation, and it's sort of the way that the participants went about making sure this Major Martin, who was left floating off the coast of Spain, this fictional character, seemed as real as possible. It just shows the British quirkiness and really the fact that the Germans fell for it. Clearly showed that they had no idea of what the British sense of humour was really like. I think some people were a bit suspicious who knew the British better, but I think Goebbels was a bit suspicious. But on the whole, they managed to pull it off. But they went to extraordinary lengths, wearing the uniform around. And Paddy was instructed to pretend to be this man's girlfriend and run around London and make sure people remembered her in case the Germans came back to verify all of the things that were found on the body to make sure that it wasn't just a ruse. So I think this is not your typical wartime book in the sense that there's a lot of glamour and a lot of witty banter, and we're showing of course there was the Blitz and the bombings and all of that, but there is a sense of let's live now, for we might not be here tomorrow.
So before you started writing historical fiction, you wrote Regency era romances. And based on what you said earlier, is it fair to say that you chose that period to start because you like Georgette Heyer so much?
Yes, I think that is fair to say. I actually started a mystery before that, but I was working full time and I thought, oh, this is going to require quite a lot of research. And I just thought, oh, I've read so many of these Heyer books and they're not very long, and I really enjoy them, and I think I could probably follow that structure and write the book quite easily. But as we know, these things are never easy. But I did become obsessed. I just had such a fun time because I love, as you can probably tell, I love the witty banter and those relationships and things like that. But I had no idea there was a market for these books. I did try to sell my first one in Australia and they just didn't know what to do with it. They said they loved the voice, but that there just wasn't a market for those books here. And so it was much later that I discovered that there was a huge audience in America for Regency romance. And even at that time, what they call traditional Regency romances that are quite sweet and more comedies of manners, a bit like the Heyer books were on the way out. And so I didn't even know what the difference between a traditional and a non-traditional Regency was. So I had a lot of learning to do and research to do, but I ended up selling one of these to Berkeley, which is an imprint of Penguin, and it all took off from there.
Well, there's a fair amount of suspense in some of those books, isn't there?
Yeah, I think I can't really avoid, and there are spies as well.
Yeah.
I can't seem to seem to leave that alone. I do like a mystery or something else to hang the romance on, but I think by the end I was finding that I was doing less of the romance and more of the other stuff and more of the female protagonist's journey as well. So it started to feel like I was always having to strip away a lot of the things that I really enjoyed to write. By the end of I wrote 10 books in that genre before I moved into historical fiction.
Well, that actually my next question was going to be, why did you make that segue from romance to historical fiction? I think you just answered it.
I think I was a little bit burned out on the romance too. You have to write very quickly in romance to really hit big, and I was writing 100,000-word novels, and I had small children, and I think 2 novels a year I was on by the end, and I think I really burned out. So actually my Penguin editor in Australia, the US companies, the publishing house, sold rights to my Regency books to an Australian publisher, and we got to know each other, and she said, "Oh, well, will you write a book for us?" And romance just isn't really published traditionally in Australia very much, or if it is, they call it something else. We had this boom of rural romance for a while, which was, romance set out on a cattle property or something like that, but that's not what I write. So they wanted me to move into historical fiction, and I was really ready to do that by then, I think.
Is that what led to The Wife's Tale?
Yes, that's right. And I think that was probably one of those books that was really the book of my heart. If I'd been smart with the marketing, I would not have chosen 18th century England as part of the dual timeline. It's partly set in relatively modern day Australia and England, although I wanted to do it before cell phones. So I said it slightly earlier, but the past thread is 18th century, and it probably just, I loved it. People who read it loved it, but it wasn't, some people look at 18th century and they just go, no, straight away, no.
You said it's a dual timeline. What are the 2 timelines, and how do they figure into each other?
Well, The Wife's Tale is about an Australian lawyer, so I was using my legal knowledge, who is sent by her billionaire boss to this estate on the Isle of Wight in England to track down the provenance of the estate, because he thinks he's the true heir. And it's acknowledged straight away that, after 200 years or whatever, there is no way that he can claim that estate legally. So, but he wants to know if it's morally his. And so she delves into this story of the woman who lived there, Delaney, and she was involved in a criminal conversation case. So that there's my legal training again. And what criminal conversation is, the husband sues his wife's lover for damages because she is his chattel and the lover has damaged the goods. And this was a very popular cause of action in the 18th century. Lord Melbourne was the subject of one. I think a lot of prominent men were, and they would award quite large amounts of damages. So my heroine is actually innocent of this charge, but she gets no right of reply because the court case is between the 2 men. So one of them presents her in a certain way, and then the other presents her in another way, and she is not given a voice. So having read a lot of cases like this and seeing the injustices that happened, I just had to write about it. So Delaney is a writer who, gets her revenge by use of her pen. So that was a very satisfying book for me to write.
Yeah. Well, now that book is not currently widely available, is it?
No, I've got the rights back to that, but unfortunately I can't publish it because I'm restrained by my current publisher. I have to publish full-length historical fiction with them, which they seem to think that with historical fiction you want one big juicy release a year, and you want to make it a real event, and doing other releases in between is cannibalizing those sales. And then, with the indie view of it, it's as many things as you can have out.
Yeah, quite a difference, isn't it?
Yeah, so I really don't know. I mean, I've never been indie, and I don't know what the possibilities are there, but this is thinking by the publishers. So.
Right. Well, I wanted to talk about that book because it did start you on this path. But I also wanted people to know before they started beating the figurative bushes of the internet that no, you can't find it.
Sorry.
Then you wrote one other one after that, which is also, as I understand it, not available. But briefly, would you tell us what The Traitor's Girl is about?
Yeah, The Traitor's Girl is basically Kim Philby, but fictionalized. And so the traitor's girl is the girlfriend who is out to take him down. So Kim Philby was one of the Cambridge Five. It was originally four, but then they found another one, I think. And he was a Soviet mole in the British intelligence service. And I came across a quote where he said there was one woman who he thought might rumble him, and her name was Jane Archer, and she was an expert on the Soviets. So I thought, well, there's a story idea. I have to write about that. So that's The Traitor's Girl. Another one, not widely available. You might be able to get it secondhand if you're really interested. Yeah.
Well, but the third one in this sequence is available through the book depository, the Juliet Code.
Yes.
So what inspired that book?
Oh, well, another spy story. It's about a woman who worked for the British Special Operations Executive, and she's a wireless operator who gets parachuted into enemy-occupied Paris or France. But she gets captured almost straight away. So it's really her dealing with, it's a dual timeline, but it's set shortly after the war and during the war. So it shows her coming to terms with what happened to her when she was imprisoned.
Well, and then in the book immediately before One Woman's War was Sisters of the Resistance. And that actually has a fashion backdrop. And what led you to writing about a fashion house?
Well, I was reading an article in Jezebel online, and it was the first I'd ever heard that Catherine Dior, who's the sister of Christian Dior, famous fashion designer, was part of the French resistance, and she was extremely brave. She was captured and tortured, but did not give her contacts away. And she was sent to Ravensbrück, and, all of these horrific things. So, but nobody really seemed to know about it until relatively recently. And it's come out now because Dior, the new fashion director at Dior, is a woman, Maria Grazia Churio. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, I'm sorry, but she has used Catherine Dior as her inspiration for a few collections now, and this story has just become really well known. So I wanted to write about Catherine Dior, but I felt that there wasn't quite enough information about her that I was confident to write a novel from her point of view. I didn't want to fictionalize it too much because it's such an important story. And so what I did was use her as a springboard for a story about two sisters who are drawn into her network of spies during World War II. But one of those sisters works at Dior and as a model. And so we have all the fashion, and it's this strange juxtaposition of all the beautiful fashion, but also the Nazi occupation. Because Hitler wanted to make Berlin the new center for culture in the world. And he wanted to move the entire haute couture industry from Paris to Berlin. And so you have people like Lucien Lelong who were trying to fight against this, but it was a very tricky line to walk. So luckily they kept everything in Paris. But yeah, that was a really great story to delve into, and just an amazingly brave woman.
Well, what's the overall story of the book about, and who are the two sisters who are drawn into Catherine Dior's work?
Yvette is a young girl who lives in the same. Her sister is a concierge of the apartment building where Christian Dior lives. So Gabby's the concierge. She's quite conservative and careful. She's just trying to get through the war with no trouble. Yvette is younger. She's impulsive. She actually works at the start of the book. She works for Lucien Lelong, where Christian Dior was a premier designer, as a delivery girl. So being a delivery girl was a really good thing if you were going to be a courier for the resistance. So she is recruited by Catherine Dior to do that work. And she is very gung-ho about it. She doesn't really consider the consequences the way Gabby does. But Gabby is also drawn into the network by accident, because she discovers that Catherine is hiding a British, I won't say who he is, but he's a British person, in one of the apartments in the building. So she becomes an unwilling party to this at first, and then she develops throughout the novel to be very brave herself. So that's the story of the two sisters. And of course, Yvette, after the war, she returns from overseas, and she sees that Christian Dior has set up his own house of couture, and she's desperate to become a model in his fashion house. So we have another dual timeline that's World War II and shortly afterwards.
If you can tell me without spoilers, what is the overall story arc of the more modern timeline, the post-war timeline?
Well, the two sisters leave each other in very acrimonious circumstances at the end of their association during the war, and Yvette goes off to America, but she has to return in 1947 to give evidence at a trial of somebody she was associated with in her resistance work, because the French are putting all of the collaborators on trial. And so she reluctantly returns to Paris and is reunited with Gabby. And so it's really about the sisters healing their relationship and finding their happiness after the war.
Well, now, Sisters of the Resistance and One Woman's War are actually published in the United States, aren't they? And
yes,
so widely available, so people can go to their favorite vendor and get those books.
Yay! Yeah. Here they are. That's One Woman's War, and that's Sisters of the Resistance. So This is actually the Australian edition, which is a bit bigger, but yeah.
Yeah, because the US edition has the same cover. It's just probably the size of the book that's different.
That's right. That's right. For some reason, we have very large paperbacks here. The discount stores like them. So,
well, I guess that's kind of like if you're printing something off in the US, you can have letter size paper or legal size paper. But if you're printing something in the UK, well, it's A4 paper, which is not quite either one of those. It's like everybody has their own way of doing things.
Yeah.
But when you set out to become a published writer, was there anything about the process that really surprised you?
Oh, what surprised me? I think that editors are human beings, and to entice them into your book, it's the same as enticing a reader. You know, you've got to hook them right away, or they might lose interest. And they're not special beings who have these different rules for whether they enjoy a book. I think that they do have commercial considerations, of course, but you know, if you can tell a good story and you do all the things that will get a reader interested, you're going to get an editor interested. It's not this magic formula that you, as an aspiring writer, sometimes you think, oh, there's this secret and nobody will tell me what it is. And the other thing was that editors always used to say, oh, I'm not really looking for anything in particular. I just want a good story well told. And I used to really hate that. I used to think, yes, you are looking for something, you just won't tell us what it is. So that's where agents come in. I think the agents are good at knowing the tastes of different editors.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. When you set out to develop a story, it sounds like from what you've been saying, you get ideas from things that you read, or, you know, I'm not going to ask you where you get your ideas, but from what you said, it sounds like at least these books have been inspired by things you came across in reading about other things. So when you set out to develop the overall story arc, how do you go about that?
Oh, it's I think it's quite a torturous process with the historicals, because you have to hit all of those notes that you know the reader is going to expect. If you're writing in resistance France, you know that you're going to have to, and you know you've got an agent, you're going to have to talk about how they were recruited, but then also any particular events that happened at the time. So you really have these notes you have to hit, because that's the reader expectation of the genre. You have the historical events that you really can't ignore, even though they might not be quite convenient for your plot points. So I remember just agonizing over the Sisters of the Resistance, because I was determined to make everything that happened to Catherine Dehors happen in the book at the right time, you know, exactly as it happened in history. For some reason, just with her, it was really important to me to do that. And I did that, but I was agonizing over it because real life doesn't take the shape of novels sometimes. And my agent said something like, oh, you can't defame the dead, just make it up. And no, not with this book. I fictionalized a lot more in One Woman's War, but yeah, there are challenges in structuring that, but I do try to find a structure within the historical events I'm writing. But Operation Mincemeat was easy because it is like a story anyway. It has that beginning, middle, end resolution, quite triumphant ending. So that made it a lot easier to say, okay, this is my structure. Although what I did, which you wouldn't normally do in a novel, I had quite a long lead up to the operation, because the two women I was writing about had such interesting lives before the operation started, and I didn't want to leave that out. So that was not strictly your normal story structure. But in historical fiction, sometimes you can get away with that. And I think I got away with it, but I mentioned it once. No, hopefully I got away with that.
Well, so if you're writing 100,000 word, roughly, book a year, that gives you a fair amount of time to do a lot of research. So what kinds of sources do you delve into, and what if anything, what was particularly challenging about the World War II period?
Well, there's so much about the World War II period, but there's so little about the women involved. I've got a whole book on Room 39, which is where Patty worked, and it doesn't mention her once. So piecing together these women's lives just requires a lot of detective work and subscribing to a lot of old newspaper archives and things like that. And really, at the end of the day, you end up having to be quite creative or making educated guesses. For example, Patty was born at Claridge's Hotel. I just decided, because I could not find it anywhere, that she must have had her wedding reception there. And then I came across this tiny little snippet of a social pages, in 1943 newspaper, one of the smaller newspapers, or maybe it was Tatler or something like that. Little snippet, reception afterwards at Claridge's. There you go. I was right. Yeah. but I would have still written it even if I hadn't been able to find that. So this is the kind of thing. With Friedel in One Woman's War, I was lucky enough to find a reference to her in the National Archives. So I had her MI5 file. I could order that and have it. Unfortunately, when I was writing One Woman's War, we were barred from many places and barred from travel. So there was an archive, physical archive, that could not be accessed any other way but going to the place where it was stored in the UK, and that place was closed. So it wasn't even like I could pay someone to go there. And really, because it was a scrapbook of Patty's husband's career, it might not have had too much about her in it anyway. And it's, you sort of weigh these things up. But in any case, I just could not get access to it, which was very sad. But other than logistical things, I basically do what most people do. I read widely, then narrow the focus and mine footnotes and, ask librarians to help me research and get into library loans and things like that when I can't find a book. I usually buy books. I find that buying them on Kindle is really good, because then I have an indexed library and I can say, oh, Ian Fleming, and I can search Ian Fleming across my whole library of Kindle books to find all of those references. So I find that incredibly helpful. But of course, many books are not in Kindle form. And then also with Sisters of the Resistance, some of the references were in French. There was a book about the Rue de la Pompe gang that actually captured Catherine and tortured her, all in French. So I had to use my schoolgirl French to decipher that. I'm not too bad, but that was pretty hard going when it's a whole book and you're not indexed very well. So yeah, you have to read
the index was in French too, wasn't it?
Oh yes, but Catherine Dior's name would be there, but yeah. Anyway.
Well, I know that in these books you've used a lot of real people and then you've built people around them. But when you set out to create a central character for a book, how much of that is the real person and how much is extrapolation from the circumstances? I know you said that you wanted to be as realistic as possible, but it's unless people left diaries, you can't really know what they're thinking. So how do you go about constructing that character?
It's really instinctive for me. I try to read as much about them and try to get as much in their voice as possible, which was impossible for Catherine Dior. There was simply nothing that I could find where she had actually said something. And so with Patty, it was relatively easy for me to get into her character because there were quite a few interviews with her, newspaper interviews, and she was such a character. I don't know whether I mimicked her. I don't try to mimic. They become my character. So she would probably, her friends would probably look at that and say that's nothing like her. But just a few key things about her character will spark. So the thing about the Irish and the Yorkshire and being incredibly efficient and no nonsense and intelligent. She was Sorbonne educated, and so just very redoubtable character. I put myself in her shoes, and then I'm away. With Catherine, she was a lot more opaque, and so I found her a lot more difficult to get into. But writing characters is very instinctive for me. I just have to immerse myself in their world and in them and just see what comes out on the page.
Is that the same process that you use when you're not dealing with actual historical figures, when you're making up like the families and the couples in your Regency era books?
I think as soon as they start talking, I've got them. I could do character profiles till I'm blue in the face, and the person who walks onto the page is completely different. So, it's sort of always I hear them, and that's just them. I don't know. So, I suppose I spend a little bit of time thinking about what their conflict is, what they need to learn by the end of the novel, and sort of that informs what they're like when they stroll onto the page. But then sometimes I don't actually know what they need until I'm finished the book, and then I have to go back and revise.
So is it fair to say that a lot of that is intuitive?
Yeah, definitely for me. Very intuitive.
If somebody is watching this and thinking, well, I've been thinking maybe I would like to try to write a novel, a beginning writer, is there anything that you would advise that person about starting or figuring out what you want to write, or really anything?
I think you've got to really spend the time writing. A lot of people are online and talking about writing, and it's really just a matter of trial and error sometimes. I think just seeing what suits your voice, and I would say write what you love to read first of all and see how that goes. And I think if you're entertaining yourself, then you're very likely to be entertaining other people. So, but don't spend a lot of money and time on workshops and things like that. I think you need to really start writing and then realize, oh, okay, now I need to learn this or that to improve my craft, because I think that having too many rules in your head can really stifle your creativity when you start, and it can give you a lot of negativity that you just don't need when you just want to get the words on the page and have a good time, and then see from there how you can improve.
Well, we're sort of approaching the end of our hour. Is there anything that you would like to talk about that we haven't already touched on?
I don't think so. I mean, I guess a message to writers, which I've learned a bit belatedly, is that there really is no one way to write. And sometimes, people will say, oh, don't go back over what you've done before because that's a waste of time. That might be how they write, but it's may not be how you write best. And that particular rule really stymied me for many years because uh, my process is to make sure I'm happy with the whole book up until the point that I'm writing. If I have this thing in my head of, oh, this isn't right, that isn't right, it colors my writing time. I sit down and I feel this weight upon me of all of the things that are not fixed in the earlier draft. I mean, you can procrastinate and waste a lot of time going back and rewriting and rewriting. I don't recommend that. But if you are the sort of person who does need to go back over things and really get happy with where you are in the book, then do that. Because a lot of productivity gurus, they work a certain way that might not be your way. So just be kind to yourself, and really whatever gets the book written is what works for you.
Okay. Well, before we close, please tell everybody where they can find information about you and your books. And if there's anything that you'd like to highlight, please do that.
Thanks, Nancy. My website is christine-wells.com. I'm on Facebook, Christine Wells Author, and Instagram, Christine Wells _. Twitter, I'm not so active. Goodness knows what is going to happen with Twitter right now. But I am there as Christine Wells 0. So I'm all over the place in different guises, but you can just go on my website and contact the social media platforms through there. And I just want to say thank you very much for having me, Nancy. It's been so lovely to see you again, and lovely chat.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I've enjoyed it too. I really appreciate you coming on tonight. And thank you to everyone who's watching this chat between Christine and me. And remember, you can always find content on ConTinual, the convention that never sleeps.